Prosecutors will decide whether to retry one of the men featured in the popular series Making a Murderer, now that a federal judge has tossed out his murder conviction. Brendan Dassey was 16 when he confessed to helping his uncle, Stephen Avery, kill Teresa Halbach. Both were sentenced to life in prison, but Dassey's defense team argues that Dassey was bullied into making that confession. I'm joined now by investigative attorney Philip Segal, who authored the book, The Art of Fact Investigation. Philip, thanks so much for being here.
Hello.
Let me just ask you, this conviction was overturned, but Dassey is not a free man yet. What happens at this point?
At this point, the Wisconsin state prosecutors have 90 days to retry Dassey under the federal act, the Habeas Corpus Act. It's called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, but that's what governs these habeas petitions. Or they could appeal the magistrate's ruling that came out Friday to the district judge in Wisconsin, at which point the 90-day deadline would be stayed. It's unlikely, in my opinion, that they would try and retry him without doing this appeal, because without the confession, they had no other evidence against him.
Yeah, I mean, how hard is it to prove that a confession was coerced?
It's surprisingly difficult. This judge used the totality of the circumstances argument in order to it was a 91-page decision. It's not a slam dunk here. The fact that he was of borderline intelligence, not enough to say it was a coerced confession. The fact that he was a juvenile without his parent there, that's not enough either. The judge took the totality of the circumstances. He said he was not badgered, he was not shouted at, it wasn't an interview that lasted all night, he was allowed to sit on a nice couch, not an interrogation room, he was allowed to drink. So there was no one thing that made this a coerced confession, but rather a bunch of different factors.
I think that's going to be surprising, though, Philip, because for people who watched that series and who remember that particular portion of Brendan Dassey being interviewed by Detective, it was clear, at least to a lot of people, they would argue, that this was not a normal 16-year-old boy, that there seemed to be moments during the course of that conversation where he did not seem to understand what was actually taking place and the gravity, frankly, of the situation he found himself in.
Well, that was in the end what prompted this judge to cobble together a whole bunch of decisions that let him arrive at this final decision that this boy really didn't understand that he was allowed to go home, that he was prey to the lies. You're allowed to lie to suspects, even juvenile suspects, but these lies combined with his mental deficiencies made it an unfair confrontation.
And he didn't have his mother with him. He didn't have an attorney present, at least in those portions that were shown.
That's right. And again, he was read his Miranda rights, and he waived the right to an attorney, and those things on their own are not enough. And the other thing to remember is this judge relied on Seventh Circuit precedents only. There's no clear Supreme Court decision that he could pull out to say this kid was coerced. He had to pull together a bunch of different decisions from the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which governs Wisconsin, and that's what eventually did this. But you know, the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the appellate court in Wisconsin, they said this was okay, and so you've got to think there would be a lot of other judges, even at the federal level, who might have come out differently. Certainly in other circuits, and maybe even on the Seventh Circuit, would have decided this differently. It was not a slam dunk decision, legally speaking.
So the question a lot of people are going to have now is, does Brendan Dassey's situation have any impact on Stephen Avery and his conviction?
I don't think it will, because Stephen Avery's conviction was based not just on a confession, but on a lot of physical evidence. In this case, Dassey's defense team said there was no blood anywhere near him. There should have been if what he eventually confessed to was true. So it doesn't look like there'll be any impact on they'd have to show a whole other reason to waive the other conviction, the conviction of Avery. And so far, I haven't seen anything.
I'm curious what you think about this, Philip. If we hadn't had this series, Making a Murderer, do you think that Brendan Dassey's conviction would have been overturned in this way?
It may have been. You know, before there was this series, the public defender in Wisconsin found out how bad Dassey's original lawyer was. Dassey's original lawyer didn't even attend could have attended but decided not to attend a subsequent interview. His motion to suppress the confession, you've got to think, was not properly argued. The court should have thrown him off the case. Instead, he did eventually resign. He's now not allowed to try any other serious felonies. But so it's possible that someone would have found out. But you have to remember, these habeas petitions have an almost 0% chance of succeeding. So it's really hard to know. I don't think the series hurt and probably helped. That's for sure.
All right. Philip Segal, thank you so much for your insight. Appreciate it.